But today we're beginning a new section, and we're going to begin by looking at Genesis chapter 19, the opening verses thereof. And I've called this series that we're going to be doing over the next few days, The Dangers of Living in the World Today. And I've called it that because I can't imagine it's escaped your notice that living in the world can be a dangerous thing. The world can in fact be a dangerous place. The recent COVID-19 pandemic has had a dramatic effect on many people's health and even their wealth worldwide. But on any given day in the modern world, you can die of a multiple of random things. People die in plane and car crashes. Even on occasion, eating something can be hazardous to your health. You know, in some parts of the world, even breathing the air can be dangerous. And in some places, drinking the water is enough to make you seriously ill, or can even sometimes potentially kill you. So we live in a dangerous world. But all of these things I've talked about so far are physical dangers. But there are some also spiritual dangers in the world. So that raises the question, if the Bible tells us there are dangers of living in the world, what does it mean when it talks about being in the world? When you talk about the physical world, that's obvious. But what do I mean when I talk about living in the world spiritually, which is what the Bible is referring to? And what are the dangers of living in the world and being drawn spiritually in that way? Because I would like to suggest that this passage clearly teaches that living in the world, engaging with the world in the wrong way, can in fact be dangerous spiritually. In the New Testament, the book of James warns us about being in love with the world. And the Apostle John, in his letters, warns us that it is dangerous to our soul, he said, to love the world. And Paul also said, he reminded us not to become conformed to the world. Now, some Christian traditions have a word for this, what they call getting too close to the world's way of thinking, and they call it worldliness. And they say that we should not have worldliness in our life because the consequences can be serious. So in what way is that true? And what does the Bible mean when it talks about the spiritual dangers of living in the world spiritually? These are some of the questions I'd like us to consider together over the next few days as we look at this new story in the Old Testament book of Genesis, found here in the account in chapter 19. Because this passage, I believe, graphically illustrates, and I mean graphically illustrates, the dangers of living in the world and how we can be affected by that. So I'll just begin this opening by reading to you Genesis chapter 19, verse 1, which tells us this. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose up to meet them, and he bowed down with his face to the ground. Now, in order to appreciate this verse fully, we need to remember that in chapter 18, in the previous chapter we studied together, the three people being identified here are three people that came to Abraham, and one of them was the Lord, and the other two are the angels. And it's these two that we're told have now left. And initially we're told in chapter 18 they set out for the city of Hebron with Abraham by their side, and then they stop on their way and they see the city of Sodom in the distance, and they have a sort of three-way conversation between themselves. So this is picking up the narrative after that point where it left off. And it's simply saying that the two angels who previously left Abraham have now diverted back to Sodom, and it's the evening, and they arrive there and they see Lot sitting at the gate of the city. Now this, friends, is really significant. In the Old Testament, the cities always had a gate, and that gate is where the people congregated. And it's a lot of the times where the officials of the city would meet. In many ways, it was something like a modern day town hall. Now, what is fascinating to me, if you look at the wider span of the book of Genesis and trace Lot's story through it, you see this developing, ongoing relationship with the city of Sodom. Way back in chapter 13, we saw Lot pitching his tent outside the city, but facing towards the city. So he was obviously interested in it, some might say drawn to it. Then in chapter 14, we are told that he moved into Sodom and he's living there. Now in this verse, we are told he's sitting at the gate. So this means he's become much more integrated into the daily life of the city of Sodom. He may very well be, in fact, it's entirely likely he was making his living there, transacting his business, because that's part of what was involved with being at the gate. In fact, some Bible experts say he was probably now an official of the city, which is the significance and why it tells us he was at the gate. This means he may well have been one of the civic leaders of the city of Sodom. Now, it's interesting to note that Lot was, of course, originally part of Abraham's family cohort, and he would have had enough of a sense of righteousness to know that immorality was going on in that city. The later part of verse 1 says that when he sees the men approach and he's sitting at the city gate, as they arise towards them, Lot bows down with his face to the ground. Now, this is a Middle Eastern form of respect, and it's a greeting to them. I don't necessarily think that it absolutely means he understood they were angels, but at any rate, he offers them hospitality in the next verse. And he said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." So that's where we're up to. So he's been offered a hospitality by Lot. The angels have been offered hospitality by Lot. Well, we shall see how they respond to Lot's offer of hospitality in the next episode. Kicked off Genesis chapter 19 yesterday, and I've called this section that I'm talking about the dangers of living in the world today. And you may remember last time we saw that Lot offered hospitality to these strangers that had appeared at the city gate of Sodom. And they said, "No, that's fine, we'll just spend the night in the open square." Now, spending the night in the open square was very common, weather permitting. In those days, it was the sort of thing that was quite normal, and of course the weather was quite temperate. Travellers would come and spend the night in town squares quite regularly at that time. However, given that we are about to find out more about Sodom, and it will be demonstrated just how dangerous and wicked a city it is, Lot knew that, so he's simply saying, "You know what, guys, you shouldn't really sleep outside. Come and spend the night in my home. You don't need to run the risk of staying in the city square overnight." And as a matter of fact, we saw in verse 3, which was read last time, the opening few verses, that Lot insisted strongly, it says. So these visitors, they return with him and they go into his house, and it tells us that he serves them a meal and bakes unleavened bread for them, and they eat it together. So he's extending hospitality. This is a Middle East tradition, which is common then and still common today, and it certainly signals that Lot, at least in his heritage and his thinking, would wish to be a righteous man, and he's entertaining them as guests. But the plot continues in verse 4, and it tells us, "Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out, that we might know them carnally.'" Now, many have noticed that this is an obvious reference to homosexuality. Only I would suggest that it's actually more than that. It's probably a reference to all forms of debauchery, signalling what a wanton state the men of Sodom were in at that time. They're saying, "You've got some new visitors, you've got some men in your house, bring them out because we want to have carnal relationships with them, sex with them." Now, if you recall the reason the visitors came to the city in the first place, it was to investigate, to see if the wickedness of that city and the suffering, the crying of which had been heard in heaven, was true. And the Lord had come down and brought these visitors, angels, to check the place out. And they were, in a sense, gathering first-hand evidence and clearly finding out that it was just as wicked as they had heard it was. Now, I think it's an important observation to see that the wickedness of Sodom permeated every segment of society. We can see that if we look at the text again when it tells us both old and young people from every quarter gathered round the house. So it's sending a message that everyone in that whole city, throughout that whole city, was deeply into sin. And they've come here outside Lot's house demanding that his guests be given to them so that they can be abused and violated. So picking up the text in verse 6, it says, "So Lot went out to them through the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, 'Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you that you may know them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof.'" In other words, he's placed them under the protection of his household. Now, this is an incredible scripture. What a challenging scripture. And you can look at it in the way that he was guarding his guests, and that was clearly what is going on, and that's part of the process here. But he appears to be suggesting that they commit a sin with his own daughters instead. So it appears Lot is trying to prevent one sin by allowing another sin to be committed. How is that even conceivable in the Word of God? This just doesn't look good to us, particularly in our modern mindset. Now, some have suggested that this actually could have been a really shrewd move, as these men outside were clearly homosexuals or people who indulged in homosexual practice, so offering them his daughters might not in reality have put them in danger. But the story continues, and they said, and this is the people here, "Stand back," they said. "This one came to stay amongst us, and he's acting as a judge. Now we'll deal worse with you than with them." So they're threatening Lot. So they press hard against Lot, and they to the point where they nearly break down the door. But the men inside reach out their hands and pull Lot into the house with them, and they shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. So the blindness causes confusion amongst the men outside who cannot any longer gain access into the property. Wow, what do you think of that? What a challenging scripture. What in heaven's name is going on here? How do we deal with this? God doesn't really seem to be appearing in a particularly positive light here, does he? Well, I do believe I can give you some helpful insights into what's really going on here, and we'll try and do that together when we gather again in the next episode. But today we're looking at this rather difficult story of the event when Lot tries to protect the 2 men who we have discovered are the 2 visitors who have discovered are angels, by protecting them by bringing them into his home. And this crowd from the city of Sodom arrive and try and force their way in. Now, this next part of the story has been used by many as a diatribe against homosexuality. Now, it's very clear that that's what's going on here, and the text is, it's true, clear that it does not approve of such behaviour. But there's much, much more going on here than just an attack on the concept of homosexuality. Because the threat, and I won't mince my words, the threat that is being used here is one of homosexual rape against these men, and it's used to illustrate a much wider issue than just the narrow confines of that particular offence as it's seen here. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah here are seen to be willing to forcefully remove the strangers out of Lot's house and basically use them and abuse them in any way they see fit. So think about what these people are doing and what it actually means. Well, of course, there's the wider principle of viewing sex as just a recreational activity, or, as seen here, as a violent abuse of power. And that, of course, is the essence of any rape offence. It is an abuse of power and control. And secondly, of course, they're violating the principle that governs appropriate conduct with strangers and the requirement to offer them protection, hospitality. And they're breaking those rules in the most dramatic of ways. The sexual aspect is pointing to the absolute danger of putting sexual gratification at the height, the hierarchy of all things. But what is particularly reprehensible here is that these actions are seen to fall outside the constraints of any civilized rules that might have existed within any city or state. So this story is illustrating for us uncivilized behavior, and it's using this to show us that this is an example of the worst kind of depravity that this city has fallen to if it's willing to do this sort of thing. Taking strangers who come into a society where they are meant to be shown hospitality and protection, and a mob shows up at the house and says, hand them over. We're going to do with them whatever the heck we want, and if you or your family lot get in the way, then things are going to get worse for you, or the same thing will happen to you and your family. So this is showing us that this place it's rife with completely out of control behavior. It behaves that's outside the norm of any civilized society, not just then, but today. And it's described here in a way that provides a shorthand that illustrates that the social structure of this entire society, of this city, has fallen apart. It has collapsed. There is no moral code being applied, nothing that would even stop inhabitants of the cities engaging in the most brutal, immediate gratification and destruction of other people, and other vulnerable people as they would perceive them, strangers, visitors. Now let me remind you of what verse 9 says, and remember that the men outside the house are banging at the door and they're speaking. And this is what they say. They're saying, stand back. The one thing and they say, stand back. Then they said, the one came in to stay here and he's acting as a judge. And now we'll deal worse with you than with them. So they're talking to Lot here. But I think this is really insightful, this verse. Look at what it says. It says, Lot, you came in. You can't now come into us and just judge us about these things. Do you recognize that? Does it sound like what we hear today when people say, you people are always judging people? Maybe that sounds familiar to you as a Christian. Christians are always being accused of judging people. When people stand up and say, look, this situation is wrong, something's wrong with the world here, those people are often accused of judging people. Now, earlier in the passage, Abraham also spoke out against what they were doing, and they accused him of being a judge also. Let's just revisit the text again. So it says, they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to breaking down the door. But the men, that's the angels, the visitors, they reached out their hands and they pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. And then they struck the men who were in the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. Now, the word translated for blindness is a word that doesn't appear very often in the Old Testament, only a couple of times. And many Bible experts suggest that it's talking about more than just physical blindness. Well, it's saying spiritual blindness fell upon them, concluding confusion. The term dazed and confused was used by some very early Bible commentators and translators to describe what's going on here. But whatever it is that struck them down, it's clear they are prevented from continuing their assault or even getting into the house. So the angels are now saying to Lot, Lot, you need to get out of here before we destroy this city. You see, the cry of the persecuted has grown so great before the face of God that he has sent us down to, first of all, view the place, and then to see if things are as bad as they are, and if so, to destroy this place. So they are simply saying to him, before this judgment that we are about to bring falls, you and your family must get out of town. So Lot goes and he speaks to his son-in-law, who has married the ones who have married his daughters, and he says to them, you need to pack up and get out of this place, for the Lord is going to destroy this city. But here's what's interesting. The son-in-law's response. They say, you're wrong, Lot. God's not going to destroy the whole city because of what's happening here. Another familiar age-old response is shown here when people question things based on, and the shorthand argument they often go to is, well, a loving God wouldn't do that type of thing. Now remember, when we were first introduced to Lot a little while back, Lot was initially described as a righteous man. But 2 Peter tells us that he was influenced to some degree by the place, and we can see that influence now playing out in his children and grandchildren. They were living in that world. They were living in that world, in that place, and being influenced by it. But of course, we all, in a sense, live in the world, don't we? So what does it mean to live in the world according to the Bible? Well, let's look at a moment for James chapter 4 from the New Testament. And the book of James tells us this about the world, and this is what it says. Do you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. And you get the same idea when you read 1 John chapter 2, where it says this in verse 15. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in him. So there it is again, friends. It's either the world or the Lord. If your friendship is with the world, then you become by nature an enemy of God. If you're boozing it up in the world and that's where your friends are situated, then you and your friends are all being conformed to the world standards. You're listening to them, in other words, and most importantly, you're being influenced by them. It's absolutely fine to interact with the world. It's a good thing to have non-Christian friends. And of course, we will have many, many work colleagues, many of us. But make sure that you are the one who's influencing them, and it's not them who are influencing you and drawing you away from God. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 16 and onwards, it lists out the practicalities of what this means. Pulling out of that text, it's telling us for everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. None of these things, none of them come from the Father, but they come from the world. But you know, the world and its desires will pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever, it reminds us.
But at this point, we're in Genesis chapter 19, and we're hearing about the story of Abraham, but particularly in the latter half of this chapter about Lot and the situation with the angels and Lot's escape from Sodom. Now you may remember we closed off last time by considering what the Bible means when it talks about being attached to the world. Well, there's a couple of verses from John which are really helpful, because we've seen with Lot here his attachment to the city of Sodom and all the worldly stuff that it represented here. So hopefully this New Testament verse will throw some light and explanation on that. 1 John, in John's first letter, chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, tell us this. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires will pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. That's a really helpful scripture, I believe, because it talks about and identifies some key things for us. It talks about the lust of the flesh, which are those things that cause us, those drives, those desire which cause us to live for pleasure, sensual pleasure. It also talks about what it is referred to as the lust of the eye, and Bible experts, theologians will tell you that that is referring to the desire to live for possessions, what we would today call materialism, the drive to consume. It also talks about the pride of life. Now this this represents the sinful temptation for power and control over other people that exists within all of us, but clearly is expressed at very different levels by people in society with different motivations. But if you take an overview of all these things, it's talking about the posture of the heart, how we are inclined towards the world or we're inclined towards the Lord. That's the battle, the internal battle that's going on all the time. We know we're supposed to be different to the world as Christians, and that's true, absolutely true. But what does it mean? What does it mean? What should we stop doing, and what should we start doing or do more of in order to not live in a worldly manner? Would you like to know what the Bible means when it really says how we're supposed to be different to the world? Well, I think you'll find if you turn to Philippians chapter 2, that's really helpful, because that chapter tells us what it means to be different from the world. So reading beginning at verse 12, it says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my present, but how much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything," here's where it gets practical, "do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you become blameless and pure." I'll say that again, blameless and pure. "Children of God, without fault, in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold on to the word of life. And I will then be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour in vain." That's what you're going to be able to say on the day of Christ, it's telling us. So Paul, in writing about this, is saying, look, we live in a crooked and a twisted world, and this is how practically we can live differently. And interestingly, one of the key things he points out is try not to grumble or complain, especially about other believers. Which is interesting, isn't it? And don't judge other people, and don't gossip. That would lie in with us as well. But in talking about not grumbling and complaining about other believers, I think it's drawing a particular attention to the fact is, don't fall into the trap of applying standards on other people, maybe other Christians. Try first always to focus on putting your own house in order. Now, the situation Paul was engaging with was one, when he wrote this letter, was one where a whole bunch of Christians in this church were constantly complaining about each other. In fact, they were disputing each other and even suing each other. Okay, let's get back to chapter 19 and continue with the main story. So Lot here has been warned to get out of town, to get out of this worldly town, because God is about to judge the city of Sodom. And I'll just pick up the narrative, pick up the story in verse 15, because we're now going to look at God's deliverance of Lot, how God will save him. So it says, "With the coming of dawn, the angels urge Lot, 'Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished.' When he hesitated, the men grasped his hands and his hands of his wife and his 2 daughters, and they led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them." So they were told to get out of town because God is about to judge this place, but they're seen to linger. They don't really want to go, do they? And they have to be literally dragged out of town. They are very clearly emotionally and spiritually attached to this city of Sodom. And we can only imagine what that might have meant about the way they were living their lives there. Now, for us too today, there might well be stuff in our lives. There might well be attachments to worldly things, unhelpful habits, maybe for some of you even addictions, or for some others perhaps tied in inappropriate relationships. What that means in terms of what this passage is teaching, it means that you're choosing to leave God out of those parts of your life. And you're probably doing that because you know in your heart of hearts that you're living in disobedience to him in those parts of your life. So maybe God through this passage is saying metaphorically to you that you too have to get out of that place, that you too have to flee. Maybe you've got to get away from that place, this place that you're currently in order that you can find a new place, a place of safety and a place where God can bless you. Now, in this story, it's very helpful to us also, as mere human beings, that we can see that Lot here hesitated and he lingered, and because he was still longing to go back to that place of destruction. The pull of the world was strong for him, and perhaps that pull is still strong for you today. But God tells Lot, I'm going to judge this city, and even though he's done that, he still has to be dragged out. But I do want you to notice the big picture here is that God is still being merciful in allowing him to escape. Did they deserve to be delivered? Well, in truth, probably not. No, not really. But the Lord is merciful even to worldly, backslidden believers, to ordinary, fallen men and women just like you and I. Alright, there's more. We'll just close off this section by reading 19 verse 17, which says, as soon as they brought them out, that's the angels dragging Lot and his family out, one of them said, flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away. Now, they're giving some very specific instructions about how he should get out of town, how he should not look back, and where he should go to. And they're saying that when the fire and brimstone comes down, you mustn't look back, you must continue to flee, lest you be too close to it, and that you might be destroyed also. Flee to the mountains, lest you perish also. Well, will they do what he says? I wonder. Well, we're going to find out in the next episode. But anyway, you're most very welcome, and today we are continuing our journey through the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, found in Genesis chapter 19. And picking up straight away from where we left off yesterday, I said in the last episode that this is where the narrative begins to get really quite interesting, quite complicated, but quite interesting. So I'm just going to pick up the text in verse 18 and read it for you. And it says this. But Lot said to them, no, my lords, please. Now he's speaking to the visitors, who we've discovered are in fact angels, and he says, no, my lord, please, your servant has found favour in your eyes, and you have shown great kindness to me in sparing my life. So these angels delivered him from the mob outside his home in Sodom, and they're allowing him to escape, and saying that he should flee to the mountains with his family. But he says here, but I can't flee to the mountains. This disaster will overtake me and I will die. Look, here is a town near enough to run to, and it is small. Let me flee to it. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared. That's what he said to them. Very well, I will grant this request to you. I will not overthrow the town you speak of, but flee there quickly, because I cannot do anything until you reach it. And that is why that town was called Zoar. The point he is saying is, I don't want to go to the mountains, that I could be killed there. And my response to that is, are you kidding me, Lot? Did you really read have we read together what has really happened to this man in his life? And he's still procrastinating, he's still negotiating. Remember what the Lord has already done? Remember the kings from the east who came down and attacked him and took him into captivity, and God used Abraham to deliver him from those kings. And that was just a few verses back in the beginning of this chapter. And remember, as I said, God had just delivered him from the mob that was outside his house, threatening terrible harm to him and his family. In fact, these very same angels took him by the ruff of the neck and pulled him back into the house. He would have been killed by the mob, and now he's worried about going to the mountains, even though that's where they said he should go. It appears to me that throughout this chapter, in fact throughout this whole narrative, Lot always seems to take the exact opposite attitude to Abraham, and that is because Lot is truly infected by the world and the draw and the pull of the world. He's always leaving God out of the equation. If he had taken God into consideration and would have listened to the Lord, well, he wouldn't have been in Sodom in the first place, but on this occasion, surely he would have believed the Lord could save him in the mountains, and he would have just simply said and done what God had said, instead of which he negotiated. He should have run to the hills, but he's leaving God out of his thinking again, and he's heading to a nearby small town called Zoar. Now God said to him, "See, I have favoured you concerning this, so hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there." By the way, the angels say I can't do anything in terms of the destruction of Sodom until he gets there. So God, and in the use of these angels, in spite of himself, in spite of Lot's wrong choice, thinks, I'm going to still tarry with this man and spare him. And I believe that's an incredible testimony to the grace and mercy of God in spite of our failings. So in verse 23 the story continues for us, and it says, "By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulphur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation of the land." So the Lord destroys the cities and the arable area of the plain around them. Now, earlier in Genesis we were told there were 5 cities in the plain, and it would appear that he's destroyed 4 of the 5, leaving the smaller town/city of Zoar. It also says that the Lord rained down fire and brimstone, at least that's the phrase used in the King James Version. He rained down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. Now I'd just like to talk just for a moment about this phenomenon and this fire and brimstone, and ask the question, do you think what happened here was a description of a natural phenomenon? Now some say that this could represent an earthquake or a volcano eruption, or maybe it may include an earthquake combined with a storm with lightning. Now that seems unlikely to me. The area wasn't prone to earthquakes or volcanoes, and God, in a sense, we know as the Creator God could create and do all these things by totally natural means if he wants. But I think the tenor of the way this is described, what is being presented to us here, is an amazing supernatural event. And the fact that it also says that it rained down, but it rained down from heaven, to me doesn't sound like it's suggesting that this was an earthquake or a natural event. I think this describes a one-off, exceptional, never to be repeated event, illustrating for us the fiery judgment of God that has come upon the wicked here in this story. Now, according to 2 Peter chapter 2 in the New Testament, this is also, he uses this as an illustration of the future judgments, and he compares that future occurrence of the judgment of humanity with both this, the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, but also the Noah story and the flood, and he uses those to illustrate what it will be like in the end times. And Jesus also, when he's teaching on the suddenness of the coming of the Son of Man, he also refers to both those events, the flood and Sodom and Gomorrah, in Luke chapter 17, and he's doing that to illustrate the suddenness with which the Son of Man is going to appear. So I believe what is described here is a supernatural destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and 2 other cities of the plain. But I'd like to say a little bit more about their location and what this all means in the next episode. But picking up from yesterday, I finished the last episode by mentioning how I would like to say something about the location of these events, where they occurred in the Holy Land. And I find it interesting that today in the Holy Land there is an area called the Dead Sea. Now the Dead Sea can be divided into 2 parts. There's the northern part and the southern part. And the northern part is very deep. In places it's 1,400 feet deep, 300 to 400 meters deep.
But in the southern part of the Dead Sea, it's a longer, thinner area, and it's about 10 miles long, and it's only 10 to 20 feet deep. Now, there are many archaeologists who believe that the southern part of the Dead Sea is the general site and location of the cities that get destroyed here in the story of the destruction of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. As a matter of fact, archaeologists have discovered that there were indeed 5 large town-stroke cities on the eastern side of the southern portion of the Dead Sea, and many suggest that these are the cities that are being discussed in this chapter. But I think what's really fascinating is because of the fact that we know that the destruction was brimstone and sulfur, and many people until this day tell us that the Dead Sea smells like sulfur. So many think that this may be an indication, a further indication of the whereabouts of the cities that are being destroyed, as we see in this narrative. Now Lot was located there, and because his description is being placed by the gate, it would appear that he not only lived there, but he was actively involved in that city. He was a businessman, and by his position at the gate, he may very well have been a leader in this community. Well, this community that's about to go up in smoke. The apostle in 2 Peter 2 cites this in examples of the Lord's deliverance of his own out of the trials that are used to punish the ungodly that are around him. But this story also shows us that one of the dangers of living in the world is that you can lose not only the threat to your life, but you have the potential of losing everything that you've worked for. So we'll just pick up the text in verse 26. So they're fleeing the city, Lot and his family, and it tells us this: but Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now you may remember that one of the instructions of the angels that we heard last time was to leave, to run to the hills, but they also said leave and don't look back, and yet Lot's wife looks back here. Bible experts say the use of this little phrase, looked back, actually suggests that she looked longingly at what she was leaving behind. In other words, her heart was still inclined towards Sodom, and it tells us she became a pillar of salt. Now some experts have suggested that being overcome by the fiery destruction that was raining down from heaven would have left her in that location to have become encrusted with the salt sea vapours, so that she would in effect have looked exactly like a pillar of salt, a bit like those encrusted bodies that we can see today in the shadow of Mount Etna at where Vesuvius erupted. But we know from the text that she lagged behind, and we also know that she looked back, and it wasn't a look back out of curiosity, and it wasn't even a look back out of sorrow or fear or pity for her friends who were facing destruction. It is more a look back in regret at all she is leaving behind. And she lost her life physically because her heart was still inclined towards the city, still inclined towards that destructive living that had held her so back in her relationship with God. I submit to you, friends, that Lot and his wife were both very worldly people, and that the fact that Lot's wife looked longingly back, and in a sense probably wished she could return to the city that was about to be destroyed. And it was that pause and that regretful look back to the past that meant she in fact lost her life. Anyway, the point of view changes slightly, and it goes back to Abraham, and it tells us this in the following verses. Early the next morning Abraham got up and looked to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, towards all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the city of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. So we see here Abraham looking down from the point where he first walked with the angels of the Lord. So that would apparently be about 3 miles up the coast in the hills, and he looks down and he witnesses the events of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But what we have seen in this story so far is the dangers of choosing to live in the world. The dangers are you could lose everything, all your worldly possessions, but for some it can even mean you could lose your life. Some of the destructive habits and things that go on in the world are actually detrimental to your health and your life. The dangers of living in the world is letting the world get inside of you. The problem for Lot and his wife was not that they were in Sodom. The problem was that Sodom had gotten into them. James, in his New Testament letter, he refers to this and talks about this, and he talks about how to not allow ourselves to become conformed to the elements of the world, as he describes it. But he puts that very practically as living in a life in the world in such a way as you leave God out of the everyday decisions that you make. Now, as believers, the promise of the Bible is that God won't come and judge us individually when he comes to judge the world. But God will on occasion come to us and discipline us when we live or get too close to the ways of the world. Now, I wish I could end today's study and the look at today's story and say that was the end of it for Lot. But for Lot and his family, sadly, things will degenerate further. In fact, it degenerates into almost unimaginable sin. But we'll come back and we'll have a look at that in the next episode. Today we're in the tail end of chapter 19 and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and his situation, and we pick up the story after they fled the city. Now, you will remember that last time we saw that God stepped in and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah with fire and brimstone, and we witnessed Lot and his family fleeing. Now, I wish that was the end of the story, but for Lot and his family, things are going to degenerate even further. And to be frank with you, it degenerates into an almost unimaginable sin. So let's look together, and I'll just read from verses 30 to 32 of chapter 19, where it tells us this. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger daughter, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children. As is the custom all over the earth, let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." So Lot didn't have any sons, remember, he just had these daughters, and the daughters together, they're hatching a plan. Interestingly, Lot has ended up in the mountains and has not stayed in Zoar, even though that's the place he persuaded the Lord to let him flee to. So let's hear what plan the daughters are hatching, or how they intend to do and what happens here. Picking up again in verse 33, it tells us, "That night they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day the older daughter said to the younger, 'Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him, so we can preserve our family line through our father.' So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him again. Again he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Amin, and he is the father of the Ammonites today." Wow. You know what? When you leave God out of things, even if you know the Lord, there's no thinking where things can end up for you. And this is a historic illustration of that point. Interestingly, that both of these daughters become pregnant and had sons that become ancestors and nations. These sons were the progenitors of the Moabites and the Ammonites, and that's the point at which the story ends. Now, it's important to recognize that these family lines are never mentioned again in the book of Genesis, except to point out that they end up in a war with Israel. We will also later in the Bible find out that the Moabites and the Ammonites will eventually be the ones who seduce the nation of Israel by introducing them to the horror of Baal worship, thereby introducing Israel not only to unbelievable religious practice, but unbelievable religious perversions. I'll lead you to do the research on that yourselves. We will see by Jeremiah chapter 48 that the Moabites and the Ammonites also mingled with the descendants of Ishmael, that's the Arab nations, and they settle in what is today called modern Jordan, but they take no part in the narrative salvation history of Israel from here on in. So again, this demonstrates the danger of worldliness, of living without God in your decision making in the life of not only people who don't believe, but importantly in the life of believers. Lot lost his wife, but he also lost his spiritual life and ended up with 2 daughters pregnant by him. Now, I started this section when we opened up chapter 19 by suggesting that living in the world can be a dangerous place spiritually, and we have come to see how that by leaving God out of your life, that can lead you into all sorts of problems. So to sum it up, God delivered, in the story we see here that God delivered Lot from Sodom just before he judged that city, but it is clear that Sodom's influence carried on through Lot's family. That's the point. The danger of living in the world is that you become so worldly that you don't recognize the decision making that you make and how it might not only lead to physical death but to spiritual death, not only for you but of course your ongoing offspring. Remember way back in Genesis 13 verse 10, in fact, Lot chose to go, it said, and live near Sodom after he was given the first choice of where to live by Abraham in that story when they separated. But in verse 1 he had moved his tent of the next chapter, he had moved his tent to the edge of the city. It actually tells us that he pitched his tent facing the city, and by verse 12 here we see him sat at the gate of the city. By Genesis 19, he is now one of the judges in the city and probably had an important role in administration and possibly even the leadership of that city. But later on, God in his grace allows him an opportunity to flee as the city of Sodom's destruction looms. However, by the end of the chapter, he's ended up living with his daughters in a cave. Now, Lot already knew what sort of a place Sodom was. You know, we'd ample evidence of that demonstrated when the men, all the men of the town, it says, were revealed as little more than murderous rapists. Yet he and his family still were seen to hesitate to leave the place when the destruction of God loomed. So I guess one of the things this story requires all of us to ask ourselves is there a place that is so bad in our life that we should leave it? And if you're in a place that's so bad that we should leave, then surely this is telling us to leave immediately because there's no time to waste. Don't have any nostalgia for catastrophic situations. When you look at a bad situation and when you're sure that God doesn't mean you to be in that situation, then the recommendation of Scripture is to wash the dust off your feet. And very importantly, this story tells us don't look back. That's a very firm lesson being offered here. The idea of the necessity for immediate action is often echoed throughout the New Testament. There are some harsh words that Jesus used to try and get this point over to people. There's a situation in Matthew 8 where Christ is addressing a multitude and asking people to follow him. And I'll just read for you. Another disciple said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." Now that on the surface seems like a perfectly reasonable request, doesn't it? But Jesus' answer is, Jesus said unto him, "Follow me and let the dead bury the dead." Now what that suggests to me, there are sometimes no excuses whatsoever for not getting up and getting out. That's what it means. People are prone to use dysfunctional situations as an excuse for not doing what God has told them to do. Reasons will always pile up day after day to not do what you should do. You cannot put off indefinitely because people often feel they can put things off indefinitely because the demands of the day will allow them to do that. But these stories say that when you leave something terrible behind, and I'm talking about terrible situations here, not situations that you can with grace work through, but some situations are beyond that, broken beyond that, and are demonstrably wrong or even evil. So when you leave those terrible situations behind, friends, don't even look back. There should be no nostalgia for a destructive or sinful past. This is about letting go part of yourselves. It's about letting the dead parts of yourself go. There's no excuse for not getting out of a situation where you have no hope of getting to where God wants you to be. And I believe Genesis chapter 19 illustrates how far it is possible to depart from God's will in your life, particularly if you continue to make worldly decisions. You can end up in unimaginably wrong situations. But what if you do make that decision? Is there a way back? Well, friends, I'd like to share that there is, and we'll find out more about that in the next episode. And today we're in closing off Genesis chapter 19, and we've been considering together, this story of Lot and his family and the events around Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm calling today's little study, How Might the Mighty Fall. Finishing off Genesis chapter 19, I said, and I'm doing that by asking the question, how far is it possible for believers to depart from God's will when they put themselves in the wrong decision and they keep making worldly decisions under a worldly influence? Well, here at the end of chapter 19, we find Lot has lost his son-in-laws. They've been destroyed and killed in the destruction of Sodom, and he's ended up living with his daughters in a cave, who have come to the conclusion that the only way they can now continue the family line is through an incestuous relationship with their father. So in terms of how far they can fall, we can fall pretty far then, isn't it? You see, as a result of his worldly drives, he has lost his children. Remember, son-in-laws, they didn't leave Sodom, they died with the destruction of that city. He lost his wife, who looked back with regret and yearning, and now he's lost his two daughters, spiritually anyway. He was able to take his daughters out of Sodom, but he was not able to take Sodom out of his daughters. So even after he's escaped, he now is entangled in this spiritually incestuous web. This is an echo for us, a reminder at one and the same time of how terrible things that went on in Sodom and Gomorrah must have been, because even after escaping it, the wickedness and its influence has remained within his family. The dangers of living in the world is, of course, potentially losing your life by getting into destructive habits, but it's not just talking about a danger to your spiritual life. It can, we see from this, be a danger to your business life, your family life, your social life, your spiritual life, and you know what? Even your eternal life. The story of Lot and his family provide a sobering reminder that our decisions, all of them, can have eternal significance. This is a very sobering thought. Even the decisions appear to where you choose to live, where you choose in a sense to spiritually pitch your tent, can be hugely important. They chose the wrong place to live right at the beginning, somewhere where he knew there was no godly influence, and that was the beginning of Lot's downfall. Lot early on clearly knew the Lord. In fact, but in Peter's writings, he was described as a righteous man, as once being a righteous man, but he became isolated from other people that knew the Lord, and that city heavily influenced him and his family. This tells me that our moral environment significantly influences our lives, and for this reason and many others, the New Testament constantly implores believers to have fellowship with those who are like-minded. We are called to meet with other Christian believers. We call that the church today. So my recommendation is to you, if you're not part of it, find a Christian community that believes in the Bible and share and join with them in partnership in their work. You see, where we choose to pitch our spiritual tent, or even where we live, is hugely important because of the effects it might have on us and our family, and even the future generations, it seems to be telling us here. Now, I want to be clear, this is not like some new age curse. Every individual through your family and through the generations will make their choices in free will. But if you create an environment where you are not seen to be obeying the Lord, not existing, pitching your tent, if you like, spiritually within that place, then how much less likely is it that your children will come and maintain and continue in a godly influence? And how you can easily look down the generations of the family line and see a scenario where they don't know or care or even acknowledge the existence of God. Now, a while ago, I read an example that I think illustrates this aspect wonderfully in a devotional book that's published here in the UK, but I believe it's available around the world. It's called Our Daily Bread. It's a short daily devotional that's issued every 3 months, which gives you sort of 2-minute little studies to encourage you on your Christian walk. And I remember a very vivid story about a Christian man who lived alone with his 3 sons. Now, one day a strange dog appeared at the house, and it seemed to be in rather poor condition, but it arrived at the door, wagging its tail, friendly, but looked like it was lost. And the dog was very distinctive because it had 3 white tufts of hair in its tail. So the man and his sons, they took it in, and they cared for that dog, and they grew to love that dog very quickly, who really sort of ingratiated himself and became part of the family. But a few weeks later, an advertisement appeared in the local paper asking to help find a lost dog and return it, and the dog was described as being easily identified by the 3 white tufts of hair. There's my dog barking in the background, obviously he's excited by this story. Now, the children loved the dog, and the man said in his presence that they would keep the dog, and they would do that by plucking the white hairs and removing them from the dog's tail. Now, the real owner heard that from one of their neighbours. He was contacted to say that one of their neighbours had recently taken in a dog, and so he came over to claim his pet. Now, the dog indeed did seem to recognise the owner, but the man said, "Didn't you say in your advertisement that the dog had 3 tufts of white hair in the tail?" The answer, of course, was yes, and since the hair was missing, the man was unable to claim the dog. That man later said, according to this article, he said, "We kept the dog that day, but I lost my 3 boys for Christ that day." As he explained, writing years later, that his sons from that day forward no longer had any confidence in what he said, because what he preached didn't match what he practiced. So never, ever underestimate the effect of your spiritual decisions, not only on your life, but in the effect also it might have on your family and their descendants. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you found that helpful. We've closed off chapter 19, and we'll pick up next time where we look at Genesis chapter 20, and we'll try and draw over a series of studies some help in how it might teach us on what to do when things appear to go wrong. A quick reminder that there's always a text of each and every, a script if you like, of each and every one of these studies contained within the episode notes of any audio version of this podcast. Now, if you happen to be listening to it in a video format, then there's a link through always in the episode notes through to the audio version of the podcast, where it's hosted on the Buzzsprout website, and within that you'll find an episode notes page with links, but also a transcript of the full talk. So anyway, that's it for today. Thank you for joining me on the Bible Project Daily Podcast, and I hope to see you back here tomorrow or very soon, right back here. Bye for now.